has definitely been the hardest one yet. I had to run up through some a really rocky section where there was very little room to maneuver. I'm not sure how I'm going to get back down through that. I really don't know if I'm going to make it back. It seems like there's a tear in the floor. There's a lot of water coming in between the air floor and the PVC bottom. So I just keep taking on more and more water. I'm just going to have to use momentum and maybe drag it, or just, I don't know. All right, so I just completed the first ascent of the Naugatuck River in Connecticut by jetboat. So this river was the most difficult one yet. It is extremely shallow and it has big rocks. It's really unlike the other rivers that I boated in Connecticut, like the Housatonic and the Sherpog, and the Pomperog. There's almost complete rapids from start to finish. The most challenging parts were areas of really shallow water with big rocks that I had to almost swerve through, like going through a maze, just finding any spot of 3-4 inches of water where the boat would hook up and just jumping up between rocks. I mean, the narrow width of the Kaboat was really helpful. It was like going through a maze. Getting all the way up past Waterbury, there's a lot of sections that there's less than an inch of water. You see all the small rocks just sticking up past the surface of the water, and you just have to hope you have enough momentum to glide over that. There were a few sections of flat water, but also it was very shallow, and there was very few sections of flat water, and those places where I could pull off, I would have to stop and pump out the boat, because very early on I got a tear in the floor, and it was starting to take on water very early on in the trip, so I had to pull over a lot to take out the bilge pump and pump it out. I don't have an electric bilge in this particular boat. The whole trip going up was very difficult, and there is a little bit of an art to swerving through these boulders and anticipating turns and just really slaloming through, finding areas where there'd be enough water for the boat to glide up between rocks. I eventually came to a spot where there was an old destroyed dam, and there just wasn't enough water flowing over it for me to be able to jump it. There's a possibility that I could have lifted the boat over it, but I knew just past this there was another small dam that I wouldn't be able to get past, so I basically called this the end and turned around and headed back. All right, so I definitely made it as far as I'm going to be able to go. I can't get over this little kind of dam or bridge, destroyed bridge. So I'm gonna turn around here. I'll mark my coordinate where I made it to, and maybe at some point with higher water I can get over this, but as it is now, there's really no way. All right, so I'm gonna turn around and head back. I mean, I barely made it up to here, so I don't know how I'm gonna get back. Going back down is always harder, so I'm just going to have to use momentum and maybe drag it, or just, I don't know. but also I knew that going back was going to be 10 times harder. Going up was very difficult and I hit a lot of rocks. Going back down a river in a jet boat is always harder because going up, you have a little bit more time to think and find lines through the rocks because you're going against the current. So you're doing maybe 16 or 17 miles an hour and you're up on plane. Also, just to preface this, a flat bottom boat like this will plane really quickly, but it won't get up on plane unless there's maybe a foot of water. Once it's on plane, it'll go through probably about 3 inches of water, no problem. But you need to be on plane to go through those shallow sections. You can't go slow in a jet boat like this. It won't be on plane and you won't be able to glide through shallow sections. So that means you need to go roughly 15 miles an hour going upstream to stay on plane, and going back down you need to do around 20 miles an hour to stay on plane because now you're going with the current, which is probably about 3 miles an hour or so, and that makes for a lot less time to react. So when I went through the boulder fields, I sort of artfully picked my lines and took some time to find the right way through. Going back down, I pretty much just pinned it and just smashed rocks. It was no way of really picking a good line when you are doing around 20 miles an hour. There's no time to react. You basically just full throttle it through and just, you get high centered on rocks, you slam the intake. Illustrate how violent the outboard would shoot out of the water, and I would pull the tiller right out of my hand. This is a 1.5 inch pressure treated piece of plywood and it just splintered it. I had my wedges here and it actually lost the wedges on this side because the outboard kept flying out of the water. The boat would high center often and I would have to get it off and then find a little bit of deeper water to get up on plane again, or just kind of ram my way through. The whole way back down, the whole 13 or 14 miles was pretty much just hitting rocks. So the boat did take some damage, but luckily none of the tubes were punctured. So first of all, before I get into some of the improvements that I made to this boat for this trip, let me preface this with a little bit of my inspiration for doing these jet boating trips. So first of all, my biggest inspiration for doing first ascents by jet boat is Sir Edmund Hillary. he was certainly one of the most famous jet boaters out there. He's obviously famous for doing the first ascent of Everest and also for participating in the 1957 trans-Antarctic expedition where they crossed Antarctica using snowcats and other tractors and other vehicles, World War II surplus vehicles. So this guy was famous for doing the first ascent of the Ganges River by jet boat and many other jet boating trips. So I take a little bit of inspiration from him. So on a smaller scale, I just want a little bit of a taste of that excitement of doing first ascents, but in my own local area. So these rivers have never been ascended by jet boat because really boats like this were not available until recently, and not that many people know how to set up an inflatable boat with a jet. It can't be done with like a John boat with a jet on it. Wouldn't work at all. And also there's no boat launches on the river. So you can't launch a boat using a trailer. It has to be something, the boat has to be, itself has to be around 100 pounds because anything heavier and you wouldn't be able to launch it onto the river. So lightweight jet boats like this really weren't available up until recently. I mean, there's no way to even get a trailer down there. It has to be something that can fit in the back of a truck. So with that being said, there's just not that many firsts left to be had here in New England. There's caves that you can discover and be the first person to see. There's really no mountains left to climb in New England where you'd be the first to ascend, but there's lots of rivers where a first ascent is possible with the right boat setup and the right skill set. So now let me talk about how I set up this boat to utilize this 20 horsepower Suzuki jet to its fullest extent. So first of all, I had a couple of these Saturn Kaboats a couple years back that were set up to run these rocky rivers, but since that time I learned quite a bit about jet boating. So really the gold standard for inflatable jet boats is a solar like this. This is set up to run extremely rocky, rapid rivers in Siberia. This one has the Expedition package. This is everything you would ever need to run the most extreme rapids and do any sort of first ascents in pretty much any river in the world. The only problem is this boat is way too big for me to launch on some of the smaller rivers in Connecticut. The Naugatuck, for example, there's no boat launch. It's unprecedented to take a motorboat up this river, so there's no reason for there to be a way of launching using a trailer. There's only launches for kayaks and canoes, and that means that I wouldn't be able to take the solar up this river. I needed to be able to do it in this Saturn. So previously I had two Saturn Kaboats, a 15-foot and a 13-foot. And I found that the 15-foot was great with two people, but since it's such a narrow boat, the person sitting in the front blocks your vision and it's almost impossible to see rocks. So I pretty much decided to stick with the 13-foot Kaboat and just run it solo. So the 13-foot Kaboat has the big advantage of being able to fit in the back of an 8-foot bed pickup and be removed from the pickup bed and put back in by one person and launched just about on any sort of canoe or kayak launch using these wheels. So even going down a steep hill or a rocky trail, one person can launch this boat on any river. So on my previous Kaboat, I had a transom riser in order to run a 25 horsepower Evinrude jet. So I figured that running a jet just meant raising the transom about 5 or 6 inches so that the jet foot would be flush with the floor. Well, that did not work on my previous Kaboat. So when I put a transom riser on it and the intake was flush with the floor, I took it out to test it and it would almost get up on plane, but then it would cavitate badly. It did this so bad that on the 25 horsepower Evinrude, it actually broke the shear pin because it would cavitate and kind of over rev, and that action repeatedly actually broke the brass shear pin in this old Evinrude jet, and I had to paddle back. I tried this multiple different times, and finally the only way I got it to work was I had to lower the jet about 2 inches below the hull of the boat, which is a huge disadvantage. And you can see in videos like in the ascent of the Naugatuck River, just catching on every single rock, slamming everything. Even on the 15-foot boat before we had a polyurethane intake, hit a log just under the water that we should have been able to glide over. Wow. And it actually shattered the intake in 4 places. I toyed around with the idea of making sort of a jet tunnel for the Kaboat, and it just didn't seem worth it to pursue it any further. So I ended up selling that one and just sticking with the solar. But there's so few rivers in Connecticut that have boat ramps or even places where a trailer can be launched that I really started to miss the Kaboat. And I picked up another one and decided I was going to use what I learned from over the last couple of years to set it up properly and to make it work as best as it could. So to do that, I didn't use so on the last one I had a transom riser that kind of went around the transom. It was aluminum, and I had integrated launch wheels, brackets welded to it, and I had rods and all sorts of stuff. It worked really good, but it meant that the motor would be more vertical, and that had to sit down to 2 inches. So on this one, I just bolted a piece of 1.5-inch pressure treated plywood to the transom, spaced it back a little bit with another piece of plywood, and then used a bunch of shims to set the motor at the right trim. And I basically just took a bevel gauge off the transom of the solar and used that to set up this Suzuki on here. And I even added this piece of plastic here to just channel the water right into the intake. So with the shims, you could see that the intake is at a really good angle so that it won't cavitate, and it's directly under the floor so that you have the highest clearance possible. I was even still able to run the launch wheels. So the one modification I had to make to the launch wheel brackets, which I actually did on the previous Kaboat as well, is just weld on some stops. So when I'm on the river, the wheels can stay on. On some boats, I have to take the wheels off when I'm on the water and put them back on when I'm ready to go back onto the land. But with this, they can stay on, and the outboard doesn't hit at all. They're completely out of the way. And then when I need to portage, I simply just let them back down like this. And then I can wheel it back to the truck. So launch wheels, same setup from before. Transom riser set back instead of flush with the transom. Shimmed so it's at the same angle as the transom is on the solar. And then I just used some flat aluminum to strengthen that area. A few modifications I made to the outboard. So first of all, this is a 15 horsepower Suzuki, but I used a computer from a 20 horsepower, so I would be at 20 horsepower, and I removed the restrictor from the throttle body. So this is a 15 horsepower, purchased off Facebook Marketplace for a really low price, and then converted to a 20 horse, and then converted to a jet. So a few things that I did that I learned from the last one is, first of all, I removed the reverse bucket completely. That is just a huge hindrance. You can see that when you're coming off rocks, you're riding right up on this nozzle. And with the reverse bucket, when you come off a rock and it hits this, it'll actually slap it into reverse, and you'll go to pin it to get off the next rock, and you won't go anywhere. So that had to come off. Also, weight is a big factor with this boat. Every single ounce matters. So I wanted to remove the weight of the reverse bucket, the complexity of the cable. None of that's really needed. So when you start it, you do need to put it in the neutral position, even though this now does nothing, because there is a switch, and I wasn't able to bypass that switch. I'd love to just get rid of this so you could pull start it at any time and go. But unfortunately, that switch is tied into the computer, so it has to be in neutral to start it, and then you have to put it in forward, even though that does nothing, to disengage like a rev limiter switch. And sometimes when I'm in rapids and the tiller shoots out of my hand and just goes wild, this will sometimes get bumped into neutral. I'll go to hit it, and the rev limiter will stop me from going anywhere. So that's a problem that I learned, to just look back and just make sure that this is always in forward. It almost feels a little bit like when you get rocks stuck in the intake and it just doesn't want to go anywhere. So I stopped a couple times to clear the intake, only to realize that the shifter got bumped back into neutral and the rev limiter was limiting the power of the motor. So one other thing I did is I did remove the electric start motor from this, just to save maybe 3 or 4 pounds. Every ounce counts when you have all of this weight hanging off the back of a 90-pound boat. So the lighter, the better. I added these tube pressure monitors, and they're solar, so there's no batteries, and there's 4 chambers in these tubes, which is great. And then the airfloor, so the tubes I'll keep at like 2.9 psi and then maybe 7 psi for the airfloor. That way I can just look down, check the pressure, make sure that it's still where it should be, because if it's starting to drop, that could indicate that I have a small pinhole leak that I should address before it completely deflates. And just occasionally look down, check the pressure, make sure it's good. The other thing I did this time around is last time I had a seat that was mounted farther forward here. This time I just ran it with no seat. That way I can kneel in the boat to keep the center of gravity super low, and also I'm using my body as sort of to adjust the trim. So if I see that the bow starts porpoising, I'll just move myself forward. And if I see that there's a lot of like spray coming up from the front, like the front is starting to kind of plow, I'll move back and get the bow up a little bit higher. And being able to adjust the trim on a motor that's fixed with a pin is actually a huge advantage, so that I can get the boat to get up on plane by putting my body in one position, and then get a higher top speed by setting my body in a different position. So it's really, I am the trim, and by having no seat and just kneeling, I'm able to adjust that in seconds. And also the lower center of gravity, and being down in the boat, not on a seat where you could be thrown out, because there were certain situations where the boat, I had to swerve unexpectedly, and I feel like if I was sitting up higher, I would have been just thrown out of the boat, whereas kneeling down, I could kind of brace myself with my knees. So even though I hit probably hundreds of rocks on this run, the tubes took no damage at all. The only damage was down on the floor, right where it meets the transom. So just gliding off rocks, it'll snag on that right here on the transom, and it did make a hole. That hole was causing a leak the whole trip, which the added weight of the water was a huge disadvantage, so I stopped to pump it out often. But I think the best thing is for me to line the entire bottom with sort of like a rub strake material, that way the bottom is not as vulnerable. So obviously hitting rocks, the outboard and the intake take the brunt of the impact, and that's held up great. So the only thing showing on the outboard are a few scratches here. You can see I did at the very last minute just throw a bolt through here, and that was important because I think that I would have lost the outboard on some of those impacts if it weren't for this bolt, because this side had worked itself really loose by just chewing through the plywood. And on certain occasions, this side, I would look back and it would just be raised completely off the transom riser. And I feel like if I didn't have that bolt, outboard would have been gone. So that's an important lesson, to keep this bolted on. I really don't bolt it on typically so that I can lift it off to portage the boat if I need to. But from now on, I'll just run some 5/16 stainless bolts through the transom. The intake actually held up really great. The grates are in good shape. Sometimes I would get rocks and I would have to just remove them with my Leatherman. The intake is starting to separate here. You can see there's like a hairline crack that's starting, just starting, and it might become a problem later on. I do have a spare intake and liner set up in my spare parts kit ready to go on at any time in case this ever separates. I feel like these orange polyurethane intakes are not quite as good quality as like the Jet Wolf intakes from Russia, so maybe I'll switch the Jet Wolf intake back onto this boat. So I'm actually really happy with my first ascent of the Naugatuck River by jetboat, and it was a lot more violent and a lot more rough on the equipment than I thought it would be. It was much more challenging. There's just so many unknowns, and if the boat gets damaged, there's very few ways of getting it off the water, just because there's no access to the river except for maybe three parks that run along the river. So it would be a little bit of a rescue project to get this off the river if it got badly punctured or if the outboard was damaged beyond repair. A little bit stressful, but still fun nonetheless. So now I'm going to be looking into the next river here in Connecticut to ascend with the jetboat and just keep the spirit of Sir Edmund Hillary going. with these mini first ascents in these mini inflatable boats. And by that same thinking, I soon will need to think of a small scale crossing of an Arctic area, and also the first ascent of some sort of mountain that is on a small scale that has not been ascended. So if I keep my theme going of small first ascents and small crossings, I think I'll have lots of work to do.